So the first sense of the word consciousness that we're going to explore is the notion of access consciousness. And perhaps this is best illustrated by the tip of the tongue phenomenon. I'm sure you're familiar with this. Guy goes into the butcher shop and says, how much for the tip of the tongue? And the butcher says, well, I know the answer. It's on the tip of my tongue, as you say, right? Means that you can't access it, but you know it. This illustrates the notion of access consciousness. And importantly, this does not cover very many senses of the term consciousness that you might be interested in. It specifically refers to what can you report on when you are asked. It's interesting that this notion comes with a parallel notion of unconscious, that is, something you know but you cannot report on. Now, the term unconscious can mean lots of different things as well. It is most popularly associated with the work of Sigmund Freud, whose psychoanalytic theory, while very, very interesting and very influential, has not really ever become a scientific enterprise. Many of the ways that we use the word conscious are directly derived from Freud and his slightly strange theories. And so Freud is behind our everyday use. When we turn our attention now to access consciousness, then we're using the unconscious in one particular way as stuff you know but cannot currently report. There are other senses of the notion of the unconscious, including things like a collective unconscious that we will not be getting into. So access consciousness refers exclusively to the set of things you can provide verbal report on. And there's an underlying assumption, which is that those things you can report on are somehow available to you or part of your experience, your mind. Very difficult to know what we're talking about, but we're working towards a practical definition that will allow us to do some science. Like every word associated with consciousness, just because some people wield a term like access consciousness carefully, doesn't mean everybody does. I see through a cursory internet search that the term access consciousness has also been picked up and used by a new age cult that offers you enlightenment for free. This happens with consciousness studies, but we're going to stick to the scientific road here. And we're going to look at one theory which starts with the idea of access consciousness and then builds on that to elaborate a theory that allows some experiments. And we'll have a look at how that's done. The theory in question is known as Global Workspace Theory. And specifically, this is designed only to develop the notion of access consciousness. And it uses a metaphor. The metaphor is that of a theater with a stage and an audience and wings, and crucially, a spotlight. So here's the theater of consciousness. This is a metaphor. This is not anything in the world. This is just a metaphor we're going to use to think with, right? The stuff that you could potentially draw on at any given moment is presumed to be, I suppose, the contents of the stage, and the stuff you're selectively attending to, as when you report, is in the spotlight. And now there's other stuff that you could report on, but it's stashed away in long-term memory. You'd have to think a lot, consult your copious memory. You can think of that as the audience in the theater, much larger than the stage, so there's a lot more content there, but it's not as accessible to the spotlight, and it has to be brought from, if you wanted to stand in the spotlight, you'd have to leave the audience, stand on stage, and then try and grab the spotlight. So let's work this metaphor out a little bit. We're looking down at the theater from above here, and you can see there's the conscious spotlight and the stage and the audience. And the term conscious in this approach, which studies access consciousness, refers to what we're going to conceive of as being the bright spot on the stage. And this metaphor requires a whole big surrounding metaphor around the body and the subject and the mind. On this view, sensory inputs are competing for access to that spotlight, so they're vying for your attention, as it were. And the stage has a counterpart in the constructs of cognitive psychology. That would be working memory, so stuff you can draw on really, really quickly. And everything else is in darkness. It doesn't mean it's not there, but that would include long-term memory, automatic linguistic processing, and everything that you consider yours but unconscious. We'll imagine that to be a vast theatre. Now that, so far, is just a metaphor. It's just a way of thinking. And if we employ this metaphor, we are beholden to an awful lot of assumptions that gird it. It assumes that lots of what goes on inside the head is properly described as processing. That's squarely in the computational theory of mind. But a lot of it fails to make itself known. It remains unconscious, as it were, and goes on in an automatic fashion. And we'll come back later on, in a later video, we'll come back to this different distinction between automatic processing and conscious processing. But the idea goes here that all this subterranean unconscious processing produces results which at some stage become globally available. There they are, up on working memory and now in the spotlight. And the idea is that you would recognize this as the appearance of massively distributed activation throughout the brain. Let me show you what I mean, and I do so without comment, really, just so you can understand the method. This is an example from a study by Stan Dehane in 2001, in which subjects sit in front of a screen, and there's a series of images or visual content is flashed on the screen with very, very precise timing. Among the things that are flashed on screen are words, and the words are presented very, very briefly, and those timings have been adjusted so that it flashes so quickly you wouldn't be sure what you saw. And those words appear in two different contexts. Once where they are masked, that is, there's visual noise before, then the word flashes, and then there's visual noise afterwards. And one where there's nothing before, and then the word, and then nothing after. So you have a much better chance of catching the word there, right? And it's timed, the timings are set, so that you probably couldn't report the word in the masked case, and you could in the clear case. So here's a sequence of screens. You can see time going from the bottom to the top here. On the left-hand side, we have a sequence in the clear word condition, or the visible word condition. So we've got visual clutter, followed by visual clutter, followed by a blank slide, followed by the word lion, followed by a blank slide, followed by visual clutter. So that word lion is probably going to pop right out. On the right-hand side, we have something very similar. We've got visual clutter and a blank screen and visual clutter. Oh, there's the word. And now we've got visual clutter again. Now this time, even though the word is presented on screen for the same amount of time as before, 29 milliseconds, there's an awful lot of noise, visual noise, before and after it. And that makes this very, very difficult to see. So subjects presented with that sequence on the right-hand side will typically say, I don't know what I saw. Now, the idea here is that the presentation of the word in both cases will capture automatic processes in the brain that are concerned with word recognition. You recognize words very easily in very many different contexts, despite the presence of noise. You recognize them in spoken or in written fashion, and you do so really, really quickly and automatically. You can't actually stop yourself recognizing a word, which is interesting in its own right. And this has been intensively studied. And the side of the slide there labeled unconscious, we'll be careful with that term, refers to regions in the brain which exhibit higher regional blood flow in the case of the presentation of a word which is not recognized. That's what the word unconscious means here. It just means you couldn't report on it. And those areas that are stimulated nonetheless are areas that are familiar from other kinds of brain research as areas that you expect to be involved in the process of word recognition. The slide on the left shows a much broader set of areas in the brain in which there's a regional increase in blood flow. And this comes from the condition in which people can report the word. So we now have a distinction between access consciousness. So these words have been recognized. And when you recognize a word, well, a lot follows, right? The word evokes associations. You suddenly have expectations as to what's going to come next. The meaning of the word is suddenly present. And here we see widespread distributed activity in the brain. So this is a methodological way to deal with some of the ambiguities around the term consciousness. The Global Workspace Theory is a metaphor which fits within one framework, broadly speaking, a cognitivist framework that understands mind and brain as more or less identical and understands the goings on in the brain as a form of information processing. We've met this approach many times here. It's probably the most dominant orthodoxy in cognitive science, but I want you to understand that it is a framework that has lots of commitments. There were lots of equivalences drawn there, which you might go along with and you might not go along with. So I'd like you to ask yourself, what kind of facts about a person can be approached in that way, and to notice that there are aspects to being a person that cannot be described in this fashion. So one assumption of global workspace theory is, of course, that minds are singular. They belong in heads. It's whatever the brain is doing, and it's best described in the language of information. Other frameworks that we've met very briefly are incompatible with this. The notion of extended mind doesn't place it all in the head. The notion of distributed cognition doesn't make mind individual and singular. And so as usual, there are divergent approaches. So what we've done in the landscape of many ways of understanding ourselves here is we've adopted one clear definition that has something to say about consciousness, the notion of access consciousness. And we've built methods around that to elaborate on that notion. So that's a useful kind of work you can do, even when the term consciousness itself is so contested.